The biggest in-person event in the movement to end sexual violence is happening this year in San Francisco, and we want you to be a part of it. Okay, you know the deal by now. We're hosting NSAC. It's going to be awesome, and you should be there. Duh. But why is our prevention track the one that you don't want to miss? Well, it's not just because it's one of the largest sexual violence prevention tracks in the country, which, for the record, it is. The National Sexual Assault Conference brings together some of the brightest, most innovative, and passionate voices in the movement to end sexual violence. We're all coming together to talk about how we can move the needle on equity issues to create transformative communities. And the prevention track is at the forefront of all that innovation. From housing justice to radical love, data equity, and wading through an intense socio-political climate, this track has pretty much everything you need to innovate your prevention work. Out of the more than 100 proposals, our team narrowed it down to less than 24 NSAC prevention presenters. Some of the coolest people I've ever met doing the most innovative work in our field. Each week leading up to NSAC, we're sitting down with a different presenter, highlighting their specialty, what they're bringing to the movement to end sexual violence, and how they got to where they are. These episodes have something for everyone, even if you're not coming to NSAC. Our fourth prevention story is diving into one of the most powerful drivers of our work, especially when it comes to policies, funding, and resources: data.
Here in Alaska is our stories, and I mean specifically from Indigenous people. They're not being told or shared.
If the numbers aren't showing up, then let's change how the numbers are being counted.
Wendi Siebold, Herrera and Tiana Teter are using their platform at Strategic Prevention Solutions to explore equity in data and create pathways for data to more equitably reflect communities most impacted by sexual violence. They're sharing about how gaps in the ways that we collect, store, and report on data impacts our work, and how we as advocates and preventionists can take up space in the storytelling of the anti-violence movement. From what they're learning from the missing and murdered Indigenous women's movement around data equity, to how they hope to empower on-the-ground preventionists to take control of data, coming up. Wow. Okay. Anna, Wendi, Tiana, I am so excited to have you on the podcast. Thank you all for taking a little bit of time out to advertise and get people excited about your session at NSAC. How are you all doing?
Doing great. Thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to talk about data equity and research, topics that I'm really passionate about.
I'm just really excited to be here.
We're excited to have you too. And, I historically in my journey with prevention, I have not been a data girly. I think because I came from the grassroots organizing space of it. And I was like, I'm a people person. I'm not a data person. And I feel like I'm in this transformational space this year, being in Prevent Connect and cross-secting with data so much, where I'm like really falling in love with data and storytelling. So I'm really excited for this conversation. I feel like it's something that people are really hungry for in the anti-sexual violence movement, and that they're ready for at the National Sexual Assault Conference. Can we just start it off? Tell me a little bit about the session that you all are hosting at NSAC this year.
Yeah, we're really excited to host a session that explicitly connects the work of equity to the work of building data equity. I mean, we should all be working towards equity, which is made very clear by the NSAC theme this year, and that's great. And data equity is just part of that larger picture. So we're hoping that by digging into the topic a little bit more at NSAC and having that in-person connection with folks will help demystify data a little bit, and also give folks a chance to be more familiar with data equity and what their role is in really building data equity. I was thinking about this workshop the other day and thinking about how I started as a rape crisis advocate in Berkeley, California, like 25 years ago or something. And, data actually affects all of us because it affects somebody who's answering crisis calls because, those folks may or may not get counted in the big data sets that we look at or think about when we think about reported rates of data or sexual assault. And it also matters all the way to the people doing prevention and community organizing work, right? We need to know who's doing what, when, how, why, to know if our prevention is making a difference.
I feel like I just need to say this, and I appreciate you bringing in like your start in the movement, Wendi. So I got connected with Strategic Prevention Solutions when I was doing local rape crisis center work, and we worked with SPS to evaluate a community norms campaign that we were doing. And so for me, because I was not a data girly, my impression of you all were like the superheroes that came in and did the thing. I was like, I absolutely cannot. And so one, I'm very appreciative of you. I feel like when you think about data, of course, thank you. When you think about data in this movement, like SPS are the people that come up. And I feel like you're the people to work with. And that's something that I've seen of every level in my career. Like I mentioned, when I was first interfacing with any kinds of data, it was really just focused on the evaluation of our programs. And I saw that as like data equals evaluation for a funder. And now I'm seeing that you all do so much more than that. What made you all as a little team, this team and your broader SPS team, feel pulled to take on equity from a data perspective?
So data equity is really about looking at analyzing and how do you present data like through a lens of justice, equity, and inclusivity. So data is information, and we really want to be cognizant of who's represented and who's not represented in that information, because we're using that data to really make decisions for programming, for interventions, for policies. And so if we don't have data that accurately reflects the communities that are being burdened by these issues, then we're not really going to develop something that's going to be impactful for those communities. And so that's why it's so important to incorporate equity principles into all of the different phases of research.
Yeah. And Janae, you mentioned earlier that, you had worked with people before coming to more the evaluation world in that project we had worked with you on before. And that made me smile because I think it's like part of my personal mission when working with community folks or folks who aren't as familiar working in evaluation or using data, to understand that people are data in these big data sets, right? Like we have to personalize data and the systems that hold data and hold so much power with data in order to really, I think, make it useful for folks working on the ground in the field of prevention, especially in movements like our movement, where we're historically underfunded and under-resourced, right? It becomes a tool for us to be able to leverage more power and get to some solutions, as Anna's pointing to, get to some solutions that actually will work for the populations that are overburdened by sexual violence and gender-based violence.
You're listening to Prevent Connect, the podcast bringing together voices from across the movement to end gender and power-based violence, to give you the tools to practice primary prevention in your daily life and at work. We're highlighting emerging research, promising strategies, and stories from on-the-ground prevention practitioners doing this work in new and innovative ways. Bringing you topics like foundational strategies to prevent violence, primary prevention and youth engagement, critical race theory and school climates, prevention in a digital age, and more. I'm your host, Janae Sargent, and this is Prevent Connect. I mentioned that my perspective on data is changing, has been changing over the past couple of years. And in a different role, I was working on a reproductive justice bill in California that would impact client services at community-based health centers. And we were trying to push for changes that we were hearing anecdotally at different clinics, but immediately lawmakers were asking for data. And I found myself as someone who my whole life before that was like, data's not my thing. Data's not my thing. I like people. Mm-hmm. I was going to the people with the data and I was like, man, I really wish that I understood more of this, because it's like what you said, data is really the foundation for everything. It's not just, it's one, how we make sure that the things that we're doing are actually impacting people, but it's also what we use to shape what we create to impact people. And like you said, center the people that need it most. And so I really appreciate that that's something that you're being really intentional about. Now, from what I understand, you're all connected to strategic prevention solutions, but you're kind of coming at this from different places. And I know in our pre-call, we were talking about how that's something you're really intentional about. Can you tell me a little bit about what you're doing together and how that partnership came to be?
Yeah, I'll give my perspective. And then, as you said, we value various perspectives. So I'll throw it over to Anna and Tiana after I kind of say from where I'm sitting. Yeah, as a company, we've always tried to work towards social justice and equity. And one of the ways that we try to keep it top of the conversation is to openly acknowledge that, like, no one person in our company holds all the information, or no, right? And so in multiple perspectives and contexts brings strength to our work. And so we've always been a remote-based company. We work nationally and a little bit internationally in the past, not as much now, but we work nationally. And we're also heavily concentrated in the Western region of the U.S., and we have staff located throughout the U.S. We like to think of ourselves as small but mighty. We're really careful about who we hire. It's a very nuanced field, and we hold really dear and close to us our values of working with community. And as you all might have realized, or unfortunately maybe experienced, not everybody trained in research actually can have normal conversation with anyone about, like, what is data? And so we also hire a lot of contractors to work on projects depending on the project and what skill sets are needed and what lived experiences would really benefit the project. So we were really excited to work with Ana Herrera as a contractor at first. And then we were excited. We got to hire her and work with her for a couple of years. And she's such a superstar. She brings, a lot of public health training, as well as all of her training and interest in data equity and working within systems of data. So she can talk more to that. And then we were also very honored to be approached by Tiana, who is, as she we'll say more, she lives in Fairbanks, and she also works at the Alaska Native Women's Resource Center. And so she's our MSW intern right now. It feels more like a panel, even though we're working as a team to put together the workshop for NSAC. But we're putting together all three of our approaches and lived experiences into this workshop, because we all have our individual experiences with data equity and how it plays out in the world of gender-based violence. We also realized at a staff retreat earlier this year that most of our staff are introverts, which doesn't surprise anybody when you think about working with data and sitting in front of a computer and research. So I'm one of the few people that also rates on extroversion. And we have a couple other extroverts, but that's another way of thinking of diversity within our company. I had to get much better at thinking about, let's play on people's strengths. Like, if somebody doesn't like to stand in front of a crowd and do a workshop, let's not force them to do that. They can be data wizards of that. So Anna and Tiana I don't know, you all are both kind of in the middle somewhere.
I'm pretty new actually to this world of data and evaluation. But what pulled me into this type of work was my practicum. So I'm currently a social work student, and I'm coming at this from more of a direct service perspective. But within the last few months, with my time spent working with strategic prevention solutions, I've also just kind of found this passion for research and for data. Because in my work with communities in Alaska, a lot of times we hear our rates of domestic violence and sexual assault are high, but we don't have accurate statistics, or we know issues like missing and murdered Indigenous people is an issue, and Indigenous people and communities are disproportionately affected by violence, but we just don't have the statistics to show how severe of a problem it is. And so how can, like they said, how can we begin working on resolving these types of issues and finding solutions? And we don't even have data to show that it's a problem. So that's kind of where I'm coming from and why I'm so passionate about this type of work, because I feel like just a few months ago, I didn't even understand what data was. I didn't know how it worked. I didn't know how that process worked out. But now I'm I'm really passionate about getting this information available to more communities. And so right now I am a social work student, and I plan on graduating soon, but I am keeping data and research at the back of my mind because it is just such a powerful tool to have when working with communities.
And for me, I'm probably the oddball here. Like, I love research and data. I'm like a huge data nerd. But that's also my training. And it's also just because of my own experience. So as a first generation Latina immigrant, so just growing up, I saw that a lot of the populations that I grew up with, immigrants, non-English speaking folks, were also not represented in data and research findings that I would read about in school. And so that's really what got me into research and data equity, so that I can really try to center these voices so that I can do my part in trying to also collect this data, design it, but also put this information out there so that we can alleviate the disparities.
If you're looking for more content like this, head to preventconnect.org. We've got tools, guides, and resources on how to prevent sexual and intimate partner violence in your community, all for free and in one easy-to-access digital space. From live web conferences and recordings to a running blog, resource library, e-learning, and online community, Prevent Connect has everything you need to implement and evaluate innovative prevention initiatives in your community. All of that and more available for free at preventconnect.org. I can really appreciate, I can already see what you were sharing before, the balance of different expertise areas and perspectives and the power that brings to your work and to the data equity work that you're doing. Wendi, I think earlier you mentioned something about a lot of really talented researchers don't necessarily speak a language that resonates with people who are not researchers and vice versa. And I feel like that can be a huge hurdle when it comes to data, is like, how much is gate kept? And even if we're trying to not gatekeep now, the impact of gatekeeping for generations. And so like, when I think of data, I think about white dude writing a paper that I don't understand, that somehow relates to my life and my community, but is using words that like don't make any sense to me. And I'm realizing that data is everything. Like, it's our stories, it's our people, like you were sharing. And if that is our history with data, we have to start doing something different. And I feel like that's what's so powerful. And talking about our perceptions of data versus what data can actually be, and thinking about that this is the prevention track. I think in the sexual violence movement, in the anti-sexual violence movement, we usually only think about data as it relates to intervention and getting data about the clients that we serve, demographics data, never doing anything with that data later. How can data be used for prevention storytelling? And what does that look like, especially from an equity perspective?
Well, I'll just say I really like that you combined data and storytelling in the same sentence. That's key. And that's a big part of what our workshop is going to be on. And also hopefully what we drop into today's discussion. Data, whether it's through numbers, you're telling a story, or through people's quotes and literally their storytelling of their personal experience or their observations, that's all data. And, it makes my heart hurt. And it's absolutely true that there's a very long history of institutionalized oppression that has been supported through that kind of, sometimes it probably is intentional, other times it's unintentional. We have this dominant paradigm within academia of what is knowledge and how is it created. And we can get big here with epistemology, and we won't, right? Because we're going to keep this exciting for everybody, not just data nerds like Anna and I. But, it's really important when we're talking about data equity to keep things transparent and to know whose story is being told, who asked the question, how is the question framed. That all plays into the creation of what we're now calling data and what ends up being a number or a quote. And so for prevention, that's kind of ground zero. We start with who is at the table, figuratively, who's asking folks to be at the table, or are you joining folks' table that are already doing great work in the community? That's something I always talk with folks in prevention about. We oftentimes get funding that says, go create a coalition to address X, Y, Z. And then this person in their office, oftentimes, a cisgender white person is like, okay, I'm going to create this coalition. And they, put people together and call a meeting. And then they wonder why so many folks are not at the table. They don't come, or they have trouble keeping people at the table. So, that's a perfect example of why at SPS we're trained as researchers and evaluators, but we very quickly slip down the slope into doing coalition work and partnership work because it's so central to prevention, knowing whose voice is there and the power dynamics that play out with that. I know Anna has something to say. I can see her brain working.
I was just thinking about the storytelling part. The storytelling is such a powerful way to present data. I think one of the biggest challenges that we have when we're discussing data findings is that it's usually not shared in an accessible and compelling way. Because if you just throw numbers out there, they're missing the context. They're missing what Wendi was referring to earlier. We have to humanize it. These are people that are being represented in these numbers. And that's what people are going to remember.
There's some great examples, and Tiana might better speak to this, but there's some great examples within the missing and murdered Indigenous peoples data movement. And I am calling it a movement because from my, white perspective, it seems like it's a growing movement. There are many awesome Indigenous researchers who are stepping up and mobilizing their communities and also speaking out about who's missing from the data and challenging this numbers centered way of thinking about data. And one of the things that the Urban Indian Health Institute, I think, has a whole report they wrote where they're collecting stories from Indigenous people who are just telling the story of the people who have gone missing or who have been harmed within their social circles. And that becomes a report of storytelling. And then those can become numbers if needed. And also those stories are data, and they should be listened to absolutely as much as, if not more than, just a statistic that's counted in a more formal system that may or may not represent the folks that obviously need to be counted.
One thing that we're experiencing here in Alaska, like Wendi was saying, is our stories. And I mean specifically from Indigenous people. They're not being told or shared specifically by law enforcement or by these Western data systems that aren't meant to capture our stories. So one example is where these misclassifications in data are happening and where it's affecting missing and murdered Indigenous people is when law enforcement are creating reports on cases and they classify missing and murdered as a suicide. Even when the family is coming forward and saying they don't agree, saying it wasn't a suicide, that their relative wouldn't do this, there might be parts of the case that weren't considered or written down. But whatever the reason is, the family's stories and their truths aren't being taken into consideration or respected. And one thing I really appreciate is organizations like Data for Indigenous Justice. They're changing the way that they collect data. They're decolonizing their data, and they're putting family stories and families' truths first, so that when they get data and they put it into their database, they're correcting it and they're not classifying these instances as suicide. They're correcting it and putting it down as a murder because that's what the family believes it was. So just honoring their truth and honoring their story and making sure that they feel represented and they're getting the justice that they want.
Oh, thank you for sharing that example. And I will list that in our show notes as well for anyone who's listening and wants to check them out. That's really powerful. And, something that you mentioned, Tiana, too, it's not data necessarily that people struggle to get on board with. It's colonized data, right? Like it's the things that ignore everyone's lived experiences. It's us feeling, it's certain communities feeling like they have to fit into a Western box to be able to be counted. That doesn't feel like something people get passionate about, but that's not what you all are doing. You're doing something totally different. Talking about, I'm not going to say that anymore, that I'm not a data person. Maybe I'm not a numbers person, but I am a writer, and a storyteller. And I feel like bringing those two perspectives together, which is something that you're doing, really opens up a new path forward for our movement and telling stories that don't often get told. Now, I don't want to give too much of your session away because I want people to get excited about it and to come in and like not know entirely what they're going to get. It sounds like there's some really powerful stuff coming out of that. So I'm going to keep from asking all the questions that I want to, but I would love to hear what you're hoping people take away from your session at NSAC.
For me, and this is Wendi, I just want people to leave with a better understanding and comfort of how to interpret data that's put in front of them or that they find, and then know what questions to be asking of that data that will hopefully turn folks into advocates, data advocates. Let's make it a thing. Like we can demand that data be collected better, that it's stored better, so that folks who are currently missing from data or what we're calling data are represented. Because again, like we were saying earlier, especially with prevention work, if it's not showing up in the data, it's hard to prove to funders that what we're doing is working, right? And so if the numbers aren't showing up, then let's change how the numbers are being counted, right? Clearly, there's something off there, and it may not just be your program. It's always important to look at your program and review your program and maybe make some shifts, but data helps you do that. That's what that phrase, data-informed decision-making, that's where it comes from, right? Like, get informed, figure it out, and let's demand some better data from the folks that have the power and resources to collect even more data, right? The U.S. federal government has a lot of money, not as much in DVSA work, I know, but still, it's the federal government. It has a lot of money, and we have good resources like NSPIS now. That's it's better than things prior to that, right? It's population-based survey. You can disaggregate the data, which is a big element of data equity. You need to be able to break data out by population, take a closer look. You can't just work on averages, but we can still do better. We can ask better questions. So we're hoping that people walk away with just feeling this empowerment that, we all can make a difference in making data more equitable in the work that we're doing.
And for me, I just want to acknowledge that I know that violence and violence prevention data can be really difficult to capture in the data sources that do exist. They're not perfect, but that doesn't mean that they can't be useful. And we can use them while also advocating for the changes to fill in the gaps that we know exist. And so that's why the work that community-based organizations is so critical, because they're the ones that are out there experiencing all of this and interacting with communities that are being impacted. So they really have a lot of power to help us fill in those gaps that those larger surveillance systems don't.
And I think for me, it's just understanding and accepting, that data isn't that scary and it's not that hard to understand or take in. And, if we don't have that data, how can we begin to work on these issues of ending sexual violence or missing and murdered Indigenous people? And when done well, data can create this powerful image of systemic issues. It can reveal patterns of oppression. It can affect policy, services, funding. It can create connection, and it can just bring healing, I think, and justice to families that are affected by violence.
Can't get enough of our podcasts? Or maybe you want to see how our episodes are made and join in on the conversation yourself. Well, Prevent Connect is recording a live podcast at the National Sexual Assault Conference, and we want you to join in on it. We're sitting down with other Valor podcasts, Valor conversations, and leadership moves to talk about storytelling and bringing our full selves to the movement. It's a collab I've been living for months now. And the first time in Valor history that all of the Valor podcast hosts are coming together to have a conversation about our movement. There will be chances for audience participation and places for you to ask your own questions about podcasting and storytelling. That's happening on day 1 of NSAC from 3:30 to 5. You can read more about that session and how to attend at nationalsexualassaultconference.org. I can't wait to see you there. So we're spending a lot of time talking about your session and the prevention track, as we should, because it's the biggest prevention track in the country. I love to say that. It's very exciting. I've also never been to NSAC, so this is all very, I know.
Wow.
Super stoked. And NSAC is a huge event. I mean, it's the largest gathering of advocates, preventionists, activists, and community organizers in cross-secting movements. And everybody, we're expecting 2,000 people to be in San Francisco. And I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the other tracks, but there's just like a lot. There's a lot going on. Yeah, it's really exciting, overwhelming in the best way. And I am personally really excited to be in a space again where I can feel the energy of people who are passionate and just came out of their respective sessions that got them inspired and are connecting in the hallways and at the coffee shop, because that's where the real work happens. For you all, what is a conversation that you would love to see people having at NSAC or to come out of NSAC?
Data, like we were saying, data can feel really scary. And we didn't even use the word data half the time that I'm in communities. I say information. And there's some code switching you can do when you start working with data to, again, help make it more welcoming. Again, it shouldn't be gatekept. It shouldn't be shrouded in this, unattainable system. Again, data is part of all of our work, and can be helpful and can also be hurtful. So I just would really love for folks to be, wandering the halls with an idea and sharing an inspiration they found, to know that they're part of the solution here. It's not an other, we're not othering data. Data is actually something that we can take control over and use, because it can bridge power, and within data lies power. And we all should have a hold of some of that power for good. So I just would love to harness some of that collective power in conversations between sessions. I would love it if people were interested in that,
I love that. Within data lies power, and we all deserve some of that power. What about you, Anna, Tiana? What are you excited about with NSAC?
Just the energy of people. I hope it helps people reflect and realize that they don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel, that like Wendi was saying, data does not have to be this huge task. Data or collecting information is really just to help you answer a question. And it can be something very simple. It could be a data source can be something that you're already collecting. It could be from observations. It could be from case notes. It could be a lot of different things. And so I'm hoping that people have that realization of we already have this information. So let's find a use for it so that we can improve our services. Or if they're also thinking about who has information that we could use, and start think about potential partnerships.
I think for me, kind of jumping off of what Anna was saying, is I want to hear new ideas, and I want to hear about new data systems that are working and that people are excited about, because I think a lot of times, we hear about these old Western data systems that aren't serving us anymore or that aren't being helpful. But I want to hear about new ideas and what people are doing and what kind of great work organizations are doing right now.
So we're bringing a bunch of people to NSAC in person. That's very exciting. We love that. This podcast also reaches people who are not going to NSAC. How can they get connected to your work, or for anyone who wants to learn more about strategic prevention solutions and the work that you're doing?
Yeah. And I know our company name is kind of a mouthful, right? The SPS.com domain was taken. So we actually shorten as much of our social media handles as we can for exactly that reason. So folks can definitely follow us on social media. We try to use the handle SPS Community for most of our social media handles. Definitely check out our website. We've been making some improvements and and our staff is busy putting up more and more resources that folks can download for free. We love worksheets at SPS. Like, worksheets are a bridge to better understanding for some of these topics like data equity that seem a little out of touch or out of reach. So we oftentimes will have worksheets available on our website for folks to download. We also just published our second edition of our popular program planning and evaluation workbook. And Anna, who's here with us today, helped write one of the chapters and helped inform that newer workbook. We really tried to focus a little bit more on some of the content on decolonizing evaluation, helping folks who are working with evaluation and program planning really use data to inform their work in a more decolonized way.
I love a downloadable resource sheet. I love a worksheet. I love a guide. So we will be downloading those. I will be downloading them myself to assist me on my journey as I move forward to become a data girly. So thank you all. Thank you all so much for having this conversation with me. I'm really excited for your workshop. I know that other people will be too. I just really appreciate the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
Well,
thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Prevent Connect is brought to you by Valor US and the Centers for Disease Control. You can find more information about this episode, along with past episodes, web conferences, and blog articles at preventconnect.org. As we work to bring you more podcasts like this one, we need your help ensuring that this podcast and others like it reaches listeners like you. Take a second to rate this podcast wherever you're listening to it. That helps us show up on main podcasting pages and reach new listeners. And of course, if you have an idea for a topic that you'd like to see us cover, reach out to us and comment on this post on our Instagram page.